But this was kind of a phenomenon which I felt I was seeing and which wasn't being sort of openly discussed or discussed enough in the scholarship. And something that became very clear to me was that it was the construction of housing which kind of provided this basis for people claiming that they were indigenous to the city, not necessarily to land, but to the city.
You're listening to UAR Remixed, a podcast by the journal Urban Affairs Review. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Claudia Gastrow, the author of The Aesthetics of Belonging, Indigenous Urbanism and City Building in Oil-Boom Luanda from UNC Press. Claudia's book explores how the aesthetics of the urban-built environment in Luanda, Angola, mediates politics, identity, and belonging in the aftermath of the country's long civil war.
My name's Claudia Gastrow. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at North Carolina State University. I'm an urban anthropologist. Most of it looks at kind of the politics of design, architecture, and urban planning in Africa, specifically Angola at the moment.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Claudia. Maybe to kick things off, could you talk about what prompted you to write this book? How and why Luanda?
I think this book has a lot of roots. I could go all the way back into kind of childhood, growing up in a post-apartheid South Africa, seeing kind of all these transformations that happened. So I've just, as long as I can remember, I've been interested in cities. It's just something that's been kind of an abiding part of who I am. But I think the roots of this book really came about, I had this interest in cities, and I had studied African history, and I really wanted to do research in a place that was not South Africa, actually, if I have to be honest. I'm kind of from this generation, which was sort of the first, I think, generation to not be born like post-apartheid, but to come of age post-apartheid and be thinking about what our relationship with the rest of the continent was. And so when I was thinking about doing a PhD, I really wanted to do work in either Mozambique or Angola. And one of my close friends had done research and had grown up in Angola. And he said to me, if you're interested in cities, you have to go to Luanda because it's the civil war had just ended. There was just kind of this massive moment of construction and kind of social change, urban change. But I think equally then, it was really this moment where there was kind of this shift in urbanism on the continent. And Luanda was really, and Angola were really at the forefront of that. This kind of early 2000s commodity boom, these narratives of Africa rising, where cities really became the kind of symbol and focus of a lot of these hopes that people had of kind of these major shifts in politics and wealth on the continent. And so Luanda, as kind of the capital of a petro-state, was one of the spaces where these major shifts were happening. And that was kind of a new moment where master planning seemed to suddenly make a comeback, large-scale infrastructural investment. And so you kind of had this meeting of kind of just personal interest, but also sort of these structural global shifts that were really articulating themselves in a particular place. And I think Luanda, for a lot of people, became a symbol of this.
The Civil War in Angola casts a long shadow over your book, and you also use the end of it as a kind of starting point for the country's recent transformations. So starting there, can you walk us through the project a bit more?
The book is broadly about, if you want, the kind of the transformation of Luanda, Angola's capital, during its post-conflict sort of construction boom. And maybe for listeners who don't know, Angola had a really brutal, very terrible civil war that lasted from independence in 1975 to 2002, which was partially driven by internal dynamics, partially by Cold War dynamics, and partially by kind of the regional dynamics produced by apartheid. And so the book is really situated sort of more broadly in sort of telling the story of an oil-rich country in this moment of kind of transformation, in particular how this plays out in the city. But where it sort of zooms in on is the question of aesthetics. And I know when I began my project, I had a few people say, like, they really don't understand why someone would look at aesthetics as kind of a primary political question. There are this was a moment when there were mass demolitions happening in the city, where there were incredible accusations of corruption. And so, questions about democratization, elections. And so for a lot of people, when I was talking about my project, the question of where aesthetics would fit in here, or why someone would choose to look at that, seemed to them kind of strange. And this really came from kind of the research, which is that I'd initially planned to work with people whose homes had been knocked down for urban kind of redevelopment projects. And when I spoke to them, what the interviews actually brought up again and again were people were very concerned about kind of the materiality of the house that had been knocked down. Was it built from concrete block? Was it built from corrugated iron? Was it built from wood? How large was it? How small was it? And so I kind of started realizing that this kind of medium of aesthetics, and whether that be kind of design, people's sort of judgment of what is good or beautiful or what is appropriate, but also people's embodied experience, a kind of central embodied experience city, was a place where people were able to sort of voice political critique in what is a highly authoritarian society. And so the book kind of takes this lens of urban aesthetics to then tell a story about different aspects of this urban transformation and the questions of political inclusion, exclusion, class formation, understandings of sort of the nation that emerge from that. And so I have, 2 chapters which look at the question of sort of mega projects and spectacle, if you want, in contemporary urban construction. And for instance, look at how the question of aesthetic experience, so like bodily comfort, is something which can be politicized, which creates a relationship or conversation between states and citizens. And part of the reason of doing this is, for instance, to push back against readings of kind of mega projects as just sort of these spectacles which dazzle people, and trying to get at the way that, whether it's visual images, whether it's sort of the aesthetic experiences which they're promising, how that works to kind of create a certain domain of citizenship, a certain domain of political belonging, a certain imagination of the state. And so one of the kind of the arguments coming out of this conceptualization of aesthetics is ready to rethink the sort of politics of master planning and construction. The other one, and in many ways I think this is really the key intervention of the book, is to try and get us to reconceptualize, especially in the African context, but I do think it could have brought broader applicability, how we've understood the concept of informality. And I think there's been brilliant work done, especially on economic informality in Africa, but there has been a tendency to still kind of implicitly assume that certain forms of kind of modernist centralized planning are actually sort of what urbanism should be. And so the result is that informality, and especially its sort of material and spatial constituencies, is still very often approached as kind of a byproduct of poor planning, and therefore ultimately something to be solved, even if people recognize it as productive, as culturally productive. The materiality of it has, at least in kind of African studies as a field, I would say critical urban studies in Africa, still kind of been taken for granted as kind of something which is a problem, something which is a poor quality or less desirable than ultimately kind of a state-centric vision of kind of a gridded planned city. And the point was not to say, well, no one needs services or water. That's not the direction I'm going in. But through kind of interviews, through historical research, and especially through being very lucky after finishing my degree to be exposed to really amazing scholars who are working in like space of Black geographies, it really provided that literature, and then kind of the research I'd done provided a way for me to start to see the space of what I describe as kind of a Black Indigenous urbanism. And by that, I try to kind of reshape informality, not just as like a product of poor planning or a space of abandonment, but actually kind of a space which has historicity in the ways in which construction happens, and is also not just kind of a product of mistake, i.e. there's an intentionality, an historical intentionality in how it's formed. And the reason why I call it, and so it's sort of a product, I say, what are called mosaics in Luanda, the sort of self-built areas. I try to make the case that one can kind of put them in conversation with other sort of Black geographies globally, if one thinks of them as kind of products of certain forms of global processes of racial capital and marginalization. But I was also lucky to kind of be able to draw on work on Indigenous urbanism that's come out of North America to kind of think about these also as Indigenous spaces. There's a tendency, and it's actually a problem, I think, in African studies to think of African authenticity as located in rural areas. And so seeing these sort of material formations, these spatial formations, this placemaking as something which produced a sense of belonging to the city and produced a political awareness that in fact reached back to an era of enslavement in the city, I think was very valuable for explaining these areas not just as kind of the negative of planning, but as sort of a parallel urbanism. And so it's kind of those are sort of, I would say, the two primary contributions. One is sort of a rethink of contemporary master planning, but the other one is really trying to kind of reposition the way in which this sort of very broad category of informality or self-building or auto-construction has been understood in the African urban context.
The Museks are a central spatial object in your study of Luanda, these informal settlements in and adjacent to the city. But in many ways, these settlements are really the product of the country's post-conflict oil boom, as more and more Angolans left the countryside for city employment, and the city grew rapidly. So you also lodge a kind of critique of some of the more received or dominant notions about informality in there. Could you talk about this a little bit more? You know, the historical significance and development and later demolitions of the Museks, what they signal politically and culturally, and how they're related to the massive macroeconomic changes that Angola experienced in the 2000s.
So sort of historically, if you want, Museks have been glassed in kind of the literature as sort of informal, peri-urban, like very similar to kind of other areas like that. So I guess one wanted to technically define, they are generally self-built areas of Luanda. You will see a variety of forms of construction, largely concrete block nowadays, but wood, corrugated iron, etc. And I think what's important as a starting point is really to realize that many of these areas are as old as what is seen as like the historical colonial city. So these are not just areas that have sprung up recently. Some of them are more recent, but this phenomenon of Musek making, and there's a really amazing Angolan architect and urbanist called Angela Mingas, who's done work on this, are really kind of spaces of placemaking and spatial formation which emerged out of kind of settlements of enslaved people and free Africans in the city. And whilst materials, et cetera, locations may have changed, there's kind of a racialized logic and a planning logic and a logic of construction and occupation that kind of continues to exist. What happened is that during the country's civil war, these sites sort of expanded exponentially because the government invested almost all its money in either buying weapons and buying food, because the city was kind of very highly cut off from kind of, like the interior areas of the country where food was grown. And also, unfortunately, there was large levels of corruption. So, but it is not just corruption, which a lot of people focus on. There are also kind of this larger conflict happening. And so Luanda becomes a city really overwhelmed with sort of people, growth, et cetera, but with a state which is really preoccupied with winning a war rather than kind of figuring out how to manage and what to do with this urban growth. And so when the war ends, as part of kind of, the war is won by the ruling party, which is the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola. And so it really tries to kind of stamp its authority over the country, but also kind of its governmental presence through what it calls national reconstruction, which is really sort of an umbrella term for large-scale state investments. And really, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars into state-subsidized housing, into new infrastructural construction, into, building municipal services. So, I mean, it's kind of multiple different things, multiple different projects which fall under this. But Luanda really becomes the focus of this. It's the capital city. It's the place where it has the most control. And this is kind of then paralleled by a mass inrush of sort of private investors, because this is the moment, sort of 2002 to 2004, when the international price of oil starts to climb exponentially. So when the war ends, I think it's in the low 20s, and by 2011, it's over $100 a barrel. So this is a country where like 90% of its income, about, I think, or maybe I got that statistic wrong. Anyway, the majority of its income comes from oil. And so it kind of moves from being very indebted to all this money. And so the government starts, I mean, just everything, widening roads, building a massive satellite city sort of through loans from China, starts putting in new infrastructures, major sort of beautification projects, redesigning the city's promenade, but also through these processes sort of continues something which had really initiated in the final years of the war, which is a series of mass demolitions. Basically, these areas, Musex, where by far the majority of people in the city live, are kind of, as in many other places in the world, declared to be places that need to be eliminated, removed, etc., for the good of the population, or to expand a road, or to beautify an area, or very often just, claiming that people live in high-risk areas, that government wants to build housing. And so there's a variety of ways in which, as we've seen in other places, development becomes the basis for displacement. So part of what like I said, what I wanted to look at was precisely kind of the demolition of these areas. But one of the things that the book really tries to do then is kind of look at how these aesthetic imaginations of the Musek as poorly built, as dirty, etc., sort of play into the state's capacity to publicly justify the elimination. And then alternatively, look at how residents who live in these areas, in fact, read these materials as evidence of permanence, as evidence of kind of creating an urban identity. And so they are kind of framed by the state as places that, and identified as places that are subject to elimination, but are understood by residents as kind of places of aesthetic worth. And this is kind of the central tension in the book, which is really trying to get us to ask the question about kind of how our understandings of what constitutes the urban and the urbanity carry with them numerous aesthetic assumptions about what a good building looks like, about what a good city looks like, and kind of the violent politics that can accompany that.
Another important intervention you make in this book has to do with these categories or definitions of certain identities, in particular indigeneity and race. And you bring in this idea of indigenous urbanism, which is still fairly emergent in the field, to challenge or complicate African notions around indigeneity, which are really quite specific and very different from North American, Australian, or South American contexts, for example. So how did Luanda in particular generate this line of thinking?
I think Luanda, it is unique, but there are other places we could look, like Cape Coast at Ghana, or even Cape Town in South Africa, for certain kinds of histories which emulate it. But it is, if you want, the oldest colonial era city in sub-Saharan Africa, at least. So, it's established by the Portuguese as a slaving port. And so in many ways, it's really one of the early spaces of what like David Scott would describe as kind of people being conscripted into a certain version of modernity. And so I think it is like an interesting place to think about like what African and Black modernity looks like, and to not see those as sort of oppositional. And there is a lot of existing literature, ironically, in African studies, which is very uncomfortable with race and very uncomfortable with kind of the idea of indigeneity within African studies. And the reason for this is largely the way that African studies as a field, and it's excellent literature, but there's also limitations, have understood things like ethnicity, have studied kind of the colonial construction of ethnicity, the colonial construction of certain kinds of indigeneity claims, have seen these mobilized in very violently, let's say in places like Cote d'Ivoire. And so I think there is a hesitation from scholars. There's also a hesitation from African governments because African governments have historically been quite averse to the question of indigeneity, the question of First Nations. But I think there is an amazing scholarship that is coming up, which is scholarship that I've built on. It's not mine. Someone like Hugo Kakanham at UNISA in South Africa has written an amazing book called Writers' Deathscapes, which is really trying to kind of start to really center Africa in discussions of kind of Black studies and Indigenous studies. Where I kind of enter into this is, and I think it comes from kind of my personal history of just kind of watching the world around me, but then also kind of in my scholarship, is the colonial states historically, saw, and we see this going back, really positioned Africans as truly belonging to a rural. And so when you look at urban anthropology, when you look at these studies, there has always been a confusion in urban scholarship about how to understand like African urban identity. So kind of early anthropologists sort of framed it as certain forms of sort of mimicry of Europeanization, et cetera. And there has always been a pushback as well, however, from people like Bernard Magubane saying like you've missed, who also studied kind of processes of urbanization and urbanism, saying, you've missed key kind of structural elements, you're missing why people adopt certain practices. And so when I looked at Luanda and I looked at the scholarship, what became very clear to me was when I spoke to people was many, not all, but many people I spoke to saw themselves primarily as kind of belonging to the city. They didn't see themselves as kind of belonging to a rural home. There was no talk of returning to an ancestral home. There is in much of Africa, so I don't want to dismiss that language. But this was kind of a phenomenon which I felt I was seeing and which wasn't being sort of openly discussed or discussed enough in the scholarship. And something that became very clear to me was that it was the construction of housing which kind of provided this basis for people claiming that they were indigenous to the city, not necessarily to land, but to the city. And this struck me as really interesting that people, and there are people such as Marissa Moorman who've written beautifully on kind of, if you want, sort of the cultural significance of Musek areas. But the scholarship, again, has largely overlooked kind of their materiality or spatial formations as being part of that kind of cultural authenticity or cultural indigeneity or cultural nationalism. And so I think sort of Indigenous studies, both the stuff that is coming out of African scholarship and scholarship in African studies, obviously incredibly key kind of work coming out of Canada and the United States as well, provides a language of thinking about indigeneity, as kind of a historical relational formation of identity that stands in relation to power, that stands in relation to land, that stands, it's processual. And I think if one starts to see kind of forms of construction as a process of construction, as kind of creating certain architectural formations, certain forms of relation to community, to place, it becomes possible to think of an African indigeneity that comes out of cities. And I think for me, that is something I would, whether readers want to be affronted by it or embrace it, I would like them to grapple with, because I think that shifts then how we think about politics, how we think about identity and belonging, not just in Angola, but in the continent more largely.
Talking to so many different authors about their fieldwork has been really interesting. Just the process of being in the field, navigating different roadblocks or even environmental conditions, having to adapt to changing circumstances. How did it go for you? Did you have to make major changes to your project as you got comfortable in the field and embedded there?
I went in thinking about aesthetics, so I guess like at least one thing stayed the same, which usually doesn't happen. But I think really the way that I conceptualize the city and even kind of the central focus of thinking about like objects and materials really came from me having to shift around my project. So when I think I discussed it a bit in the book, but it was really like a big change to me. I'd really thought I was sort of very enamored with this idea of doing like a really detailed neighborhood study, because I do still think that there's sort of like a shortage of them for studies of urban Africa. Um, and I was really enamored with this idea that I would like do this really detailed, classic ethnographic sort of neighborhood, speaking to everybody as they, I don't know, on the daily. And I think once I really settled in, I realized this wasn't going to be possible for a variety of reasons. I was very lucky to be able to collaborate with some very generous sort of community organizations and local NGOs that did work in various mosaics around the city. And as I kind of started doing interviews and meeting people, I think what struck me so much was that there really was, and this is sort of, again, I guess obvious, but I think it's one of those things you almost have to pick up from the ground. There wasn't sort of one story of the city. And in some ways, what was happening was so transformational that it was a story that kind of needed to move across the city to grasp it. So I went from what I thought was going to be like a very located project to one which really moves around different parts of the city. And that might seem small, but it also forced me to think about like what the city was, what the kind of the everyday obstacles were to movement, to kind of getting things done. And I think that's when kind of the city as object to really force the aesthetic aspect of the work came in. So I think that was a really key shift, was that kind of objects and pipes, etc. And I sort of forced themselves on me so that I really had to think about like, why does it matter that the water's not coming up the pipe today? You know, so that I think another key thing, and it's something I really always sort of champion now, because I think I hadn't taken it as seriously until I got there, was just the extent to which I actually did land up engaging sort of representatives of the Angolan state in the research. I think there is a tendency very often to say, you know, like it's these top-down plans, and so we, you know, this is like, I don't know, either just very evil or there's sort of, it's not worth speaking to people because we're going to get a particular version. But I found it, you know, I was doing kind of, I was collaborating or being assisted by an organization that did a lot of amazing work in kind of mosaic areas around kind of service delivery and even teaching people to read budgets and things like that, but was also engaged with the state. And they kind of encouraged me to actually, you know, like go to an office, write a letter and say, I'd like to speak to someone about what they think about this project. And for me, it was really transformational in really coming to grips with the way that different state offices, different people in the state really thought about the city. And I think it really enriched my understanding of what was happening. And I think I'd probably said in my proposals that I would, you know, speak to some people from the state, but I don't think I appreciated how key it was for really thinking about the politics, recognizing that citizenship and belonging is this constant kind of back and forth between different actors rather than just kind of something which people in position in one particular location are grappling with. So I would say like those two aspects were really key and changed what I was doing.
I guess the last thing as we start to wrap up, what are you hoping readers will take away from this book? Urbanists, anthropologists, geographers, maybe even architects and planners. I think the potential audience could be quite broad here. What do you want them to understand?
I think it's twofold. I would hope that, you know, at a very basic, someone might pick up the book and say like, hey, this idea of kind of the way that aesthetics makes us see certain things as legitimate or illegitimate is really interesting. And maybe I'm doing research in, I don't know, Moscow, or maybe I'm doing research in Buenos Aires, but it's something that can move around and we can open up a conversation. But I hope, and I don't know if I've been successful, I think there's a way in which trying to get the book out sometimes dampens kind of the voices or the aspirations or the interests of the people we were engaged in about like why they participated in the research, what was really happening in the city. And so I've tried, I don't think I've always been successful, but I've tried to kind of, I hope that some of kind of the life of the city and some of those stories will stick with people. Like I hope that there is something in the book that has done justice to that collection of stories that would maybe, if a student reads it or someone else, build an interest in Angola or build an interest in city, or just develop an appreciation of what happened there and maybe enable people to understand other processes around the world like that.
My thanks to Claudia Gastrow, author of The Aesthetics of Belonging from UNC Press. You can find a link to the book in our show notes. You've been listening to UAR Remixed, a podcast by the journal Urban Affairs Review. Special thanks to Drexel University and the editors at UAR. Music is by Blue Dot Sessions. This show was mixed and produced by Aidan McLaughlin and written and produced by me, Emily Holloway. You can find us on Blue Sky at urbanaffairsreview.bluesky.social for updates on the journal and the show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.